Book 2, Chapter 2 of The Lancashire Witches. This recording is in the public domain. Reading by Andy Minter. The Lancashire Witches, A Romance of Pendle Forest, by William Harrison Ainsworth. Book 2, Pendle Forest. Chapter 2, Read Hall. The road taken by the party on quitting Whalley led up the side of a hill, which, broken into picturesque inequalities, and partially clothed with trees, sloped down to the very brink of the Calder. Winding round the broad green plain, heretofore described, with the lovely knoll in the midst of it, and which formed, with the woody hills encircling it, a perfect amphitheatre, the river was ever an object of beauty, sometimes lost beneath overhanging boughs or high banks, anon bursting forth where least expected, now rushing swiftly over its shallow and rocky bed, now subsiding into a smooth full current. The abbey and the village were screened from view by the lower part of the hill, which the horseman was scaling, but the old bridge and a few cottages at the foot of Whalley Nab, with their thin blue smoke mounting into the pure morning air, gave life and interest to the picture. Hence, from base to summit, Whalley Nab stood revealed, and the verdant lawns opening out amidst the woods feathering its heights were fully discernible. Placed by nature as the guardian of this fair valley, the lofty eminence well became the post assigned to it. None of the belt of hills connected with it were so well wooded as their leader, nor so beautiful in form, while some of them were overtopped by the bleak fells of Longridge, rising at a distance behind them. Nor were those exquisite contrasts wanting which are only to be seen in full perfection when the day is freshest and the dew is still heavy on the grass. The near side of the hill was plunged in deep shade. Thin gauzy vapour hung on the stream beneath, while on the opposite heights, and where the great boulder stones were visible in the bed of the river, all was sparkling with sunshine. So enchanting was the prospect, that, though perfectly familiar with it, the two foremost horsemen drew in the rein to contemplate it. High above them, on a sandbank, through which their giant roots protruded, shot up two tall silver-stemmed beech trees, forming with their newly opened foliage a canopy of tenderest green. Farther on appeared a grove of oaks, scarcely in leaf, and below were several fine sycamores, already green and umbrageous, intermingled with elms, ashes, and horse chestnuts, and overshadowing brakes covered with maples, alders, and hazels. The other spaces among the trees were enlivened by patches of yellow flowering and odorous gorse. Mixed with the warblings of innumerable feathered songsters were heard the cheering notes of the cuckoo, and the newly arrived swallows were seen chasing the flies along the plain, or skimming over the surface of the river. Already had Richard's depression yielded to the exhilarating freshness of the morning, and the same kindly influence produced a more salutary effect on Nicholas than Parson Dewhurst's lecture had been able to accomplish. The worthy squire was a true lover of nature, admiring her in all her forms, whether arrayed in pomp of wood and verdure, as in the lovely landscape before him, or dreary and desolate, as in the heathy forest wastes they were about to traverse. While breathing the fresh morning air, inhaling the fragrance of the wild flowers, and listening to the warbling of the birds, he took a well pleased survey of the scene, commencing with the bridge passing over Whalley Nab, and the mountainous circle conjoined with it, till his gaze settled on Morton Hall, the noble mansion finely situated on a shoulder of a hill beyond him, and commanding the entire valley. "Were I not owner of Downham," he observed to Richard, "I should wish to be master of Morton." And then, pointing to the green area below, he added, "What a capital spot for a race! There we might try the speed of our nags for the 20 pieces I talked of yesterday, and the judges of the match, and those who chose to look on, might station themselves on yon knoll, which seems made for the express purpose. 3 years ago, I remember, a fair was held upon that plain, and the foot races, the wrestling matches, and the various sports and pastimes of the rustics, viewed from the knoll, formed the prettiest sight ever looked upon. But, pleasant as the prospect is, we must not tarry here all day." Before setting forward, he cast a glance towards Pendle Hill, which formed the most prominent object of view on the left, and lay, like a leviathan, basking in the sunshine. The vast mass rose up gradually, until, at its further extremity, it attained an altitude of more than 1800 feet above the sea. At the present moment it was without a cloud, and the whole of its broad outline was distinctly visible. "I love Pendle Hill," cried Nicholas, enthusiastically, "and from whatever side I view it, whether from this place, where I see it from end to end, from its lowest point to its highest, from Padiham, where it frowns upon me, from Clithero, where it smiles, or from Downham, where it rises in full majesty before me, from all points and under all aspects, whether robed in mist or radiant with sunshine, I delight in it. Born beneath its giant shadow, I look upon it with filial regard. Some folks say Pendle Hill wants grandeur and sublimity, but they themselves must be wanting in taste. Its broad, round, smooth mass is better than the roughest, craggiest, shaggiest, and most shapely splintered mountain of them all. And then what a view it commands! Lancaster, with its grey old castle on one hand, York, with its reverend minster, on the other, the Irish Sea and its wild coast, fell, forest, moor, and valley, watered by the Ribble, the Hodder, the Calder, and the Lime, rivers not to be matched for beauty. You recollect the old district. Inglesborough, Pendle Hill, and Pennygent are the highest hills between Scotland and Trent. This vouches for its height, but there are two other doggerel lines still more to the purpose. Pendle Hill, Pennygent, and Inglesborough are three such hills as you'll not find by seeking England thorough. With this opinion I quite agree. There is no hill in England like Pendle Hill." "Every man to his taste, squire," observed Potts; "but to my mind Pendle Hill has no other recommendation than its size. I think it a great, brown, ugly, humpy mass, without beauty of form or any striking character. I hate your bleak Lancashire hills, with heathy ranges on the top, fit only for the sustenance of a few poor half starved sheep; and as to the view from them, it is little else than a continuous range of moors and dwarf forests. Highgate Hill is quite mountain enough for me, and Hampstead Heath wild enough for any civilised purpose." "A veritable son of Cockayne," muttered Nicholas, contemptuously. Riding on, and entering the grove of oaks, he lost sight of his favourite hill, though glimpses were occasionally caught through the trees of the lovely valley below. Soon afterwards the party turned off on the left, and presently arrived at a gate which admitted them to Read Park. 5 minutes' canter over the springy turf then brought them to the house. The manor of Reeved, or Reed, came into the possession of the Nowell family in the time of Edward III, and extended on one side within a mile of Whalley, from which township it was divided by a deep woody ravine, taking its name from the little village of Sabden, and on the other stretched far into Pendle Forest. The hall was situated on an eminence forming part of the heights of Padiham, and faced a wide valley watered by the Calder, and consisting chiefly of barren tracts of moor and forest land, bounded by the high hills near Accrington and Rossendale. On the left, some half dozen miles off, lay Burnley, and the greater part of the land in this direction, being unenclosed and thinly peopled, had a dark dreary look, that served to enhance the green beauty of the well cultivated district on the right. Behind the mansion, thick woods extended to the very confines of Pendle Forest, of which indeed they originally formed part; and here, if the course of the stream flowing through the gully of Sabden were followed, every variety of brake, glen, and dingle might be found. Read Hall was a large and commodious mansion, forming, with a centre and two advancing wings, three sides of a square, between which was a grass plot ornamented with a dial. The gardens were laid out in the taste of the time, with trim alleys and parterres, terraces and steps, stone statues, and clipped yews. The house was kept up well and consistently by its owner, who lived like a country gentleman with a good estate, entertained his friends hospitably, but without any parade, and was never needlessly lavish in his expenditure, unless, perhaps, in the instance of the large ostentatious pew erected by him in the parish church of Whalley, and which, considering he had a private chapel at home, and maintained a domestic chaplain to do duty in it, seemed little required, and drew upon him the censure of the neighbouring gossips, who said there was more of pride than religion in his pew. With the chapel at the Hall a curious history was afterwards connected. Converted into a dining room by a descendant of Roger Nowell, the apartment was incautiously occupied by the planner of the alterations before the plaster was thoroughly dried, in consequence of which he caught a severe cold, and died in the desecrated chamber, his fate being looked upon as a judgment. With many good qualities, Roger Nowell was little liked. His austere and sarcastic manner repelled his equals, and his harshness made him an object of dislike and dread among his inferiors. Besides being the terror of all evil doers, he was a hard man in his dealings, though he endeavoured to be just, and persuaded himself he was so. A year or two before, having been appointed sheriff of the county, he had discharged the important office with so much zeal and ability, as well as liberality, that he rose considerably in public estimation. It was during this period that Master Potts came under his notice at Lancaster, and the little attorney's shrewdness gained him an excellent client in the owner of Read. Roger Nowell was a widower, but his son, who resided with him, was married, and had a family, so that the hall was fully occupied. Roger Nowell was turned 60, but he was still in the full vigour of mind and body, his temperate and active habits keeping him healthy. He was of a spare, muscular frame, somewhat bent in the shoulders, and had very sharp features, keen grey eyes, a close mouth, and prominent chin. His hair was white as silver, but his eyebrows were still black and bushy. Seeing the party approach, the lord of the mansion came forth to meet them, and begged them to dismount for a moment and refresh themselves. Richard excused himself, but Nicholas sprang from his saddle, and Potts, though somewhat more slowly, imitated his example. An open door admitted them to the entrance hall, where a repast was spread, of which the host pressed his guests to partake, but Nicholas declined on the score of having just breakfasted, notwithstanding which he was easily prevailed upon to take a cup of ale. Leaving him to discuss it, Nowell led the attorney to a well-furnished library, where he usually transacted his magisterial business, and held a few minutes' private conference with him, after which they returned to Nicholas, and by this time, the magistrate's own horse being brought round, the party mounted once more. The attorney regretted abandoning his seat, for Flint indulged him with another exhibition, somewhat similar to the first, though of less duration, for a vigorous application of the hunting whip brought the wrong-headed little animal to reason. Elated by the victory he had obtained over Flint, and anticipating a successful issue to the expedition, Master Potts was in excellent spirits, and found a great deal to admire in the domain of his honoured and singularly good client. Though not very genuine, his admiration was deservedly bestowed. The portion of the park they were now traversing was extremely diversified and beautiful, with long sweeping lawns studded with fine trees, among which were many ancient thorns, now in full bloom, and richly scenting the gale. Herds of deer were nipping the short grass, browsing the lower spray of the ashes, or couching amid the ferny hollows. It was now that Nicholas, who had been all along anxious to try the speed of his horse, proposed to Richard a gallop towards a clump of trees about a mile off, and the young man assenting, away they started. Master Potts started too, for Flint did not like to be left behind, but the mettlesome pony was soon distanced. For some time the two horses kept so closely together that it was difficult to say which would arrive at the goal first, but by and by Robin got ahead. Though at first indifferent to the issue of the race, the spirit of emulation soon seized upon Richard, and spurring Merlin, the noble animal sprang forward, and was once again by the side of his opponent. For a quarter of a mile the ground had been tolerably level and the sod firm, but they now approached a swamp, and in his eagerness Nicholas did not take sufficient precaution, and got involved in it before he was aware. Richard was more fortunate, having kept on the right where the ground was hard. Seeing Nicholas struggling out of the marshy soil, he would have stayed for him, but the latter bade him go on, saying he would soon be up with him, and he made good his words. Soon after this, their course was interrupted by a brook, and both horses having cleared it excellently, they kept well together again for a short time, when they neared a deep dyke which lay between them and the clump of trees. On descrying it, Richard pointed out a course to the left, but Nicholas held on, unheeding the caution. Fully expecting to see him break his neck, for the dyke was of formidable width, Richard watched him with apprehension. But the squire gave him a reassuring nod, and went on. Neither horse nor man faltered, though failure would have been certain destruction to both. The wide trench now yawned before them. They were upon its edge, and, without trusting himself to measure it with his eye, Nicholas clapped spurs into Robin's side. The brave horse sprang forward, and landed him safely on the opposite bank. Hallooing cheerfully, as soon as he could check his courser, the squire wheeled round, and rode back to look at the dyke he had crossed. Its width was terrific, and fairly astounded him. Robin snorted loudly, as if proud of his achievement, and showed some disposition to return, but the squire was quite content with what he had done. The exploit afterwards became a theme of wonder throughout the country, and the spot was long afterwards pointed out as Squire Nicholas's Leap. But there was not another horseman found daring enough to repeat the experiment. Richard had to make a considerable circuit to join his cousin, and while he was going round, Nicholas looked out for the others. In the distance he could see Roger Nowell riding leisurely on, followed by Sparshot and a couple of grooms, who had come with their master from the hall, while midway, to his surprise, he perceived Flint galloping without a rider. A closer examination showed the squire what had happened. Like himself, Master Potts had incautiously approached the swamp, and, getting entangled in it, was thrown head foremost into the slough, out of which he was now floundering, covered from head to foot with inky coloured slime. As soon as they were aware of the accident, the two grooms pushed forward, and one of them galloped after Flint, whom he succeeded at last in catching, while the other, with difficulty preserving his countenance at the woeful plight of the attorney, who looked as black as a negro, pointed out a cottage in the hollow, which belonged to one of the keepers, and offered to conduct him thither. Potts gladly assented, and soon gained the little tenement, where he was being washed and rubbed down by a couple of stout wenches, when the rest of the party came up. It was impossible to help laughing at him. But Potts took the merriment in good part, and to show he was not disheartened by the misadventure, as soon as circumstances would permit, he mounted the unlucky pony, and the cavalcade set forward again. CHAPTER 3